Great
Well,
to meet you.
nice to meet you as well.
You've traveled quite a road in life.
Yeah, can't keep. Oh, wait, we're recording. I got to be careful what I say.
No, well,
Can't hold a job. People running after me. So got
well,
to travel.
yeah, absolutely. Well, you got to make ends meet, but it's great to meet you. Where are you coming out of?
I'm in Seattle today.
Okay, so you travel quite a bit.
I do travel quite a bit. I have no idea where I was last week.
There you go. Well, I'm coming out of Kansas City, which is quickly becoming a hotbed of Taylor Swift jokes and things we never saw coming.
Oh, right, of course, of course. Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I remember, gosh, who was it? Was it Mark Gastineau who played for the Jets?
Yeah.
There was, I think he was dating someone who became more famous than he. Maybe it was Sylvester Stallone's girlfriend who was in Rocky Four.
Bridget
Uh,
Nielsen or whatever.
Nielsen, yeah.
Yeah.
I have some recollection because I was a young guy in Washington at the time.
Yeah.
Um, that he may have been dating her, and I thought at the time, his career will last another year.
Yeah, right.
Though, of course, her career was not much longer than his. So there
No.
you go.
It worked out pretty good. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's kind of bizarre. But yeah, man, it's great to meet you. And I'm looking forward to the peeling back the layers of your very interesting life. And I want to begin everything with living through a pandemic the last 3.5 years. How did you get through it and how did it change you?
Well, I got through it with a lot of family in my in my house. My wife and I were expecting we'd be empty nesters. That never happened. The kids came back, and I actually, in in, in one obvious sense, the pandemic was horrifying. Right, we lost 1 million American lives and many more times across the world. For our family, we were blessed because we were safe. We were able to stay safe. And for my wife and for me, it was like some newfound time with our children, which we weren't expecting.
Yeah.
Now, we also had to fill up the day, and that meant playing board games and playing croquet and ordering, pickleball nets and all sorts of things so that we would have more fun around the house.
Yeah.
I can't say I enjoyed every one of those diversions.
Right.
Um, yes, I mean, have you ever played Settlers of Catan?
Ah,
Yeah, some people, Joe, have a bucket list. I have a reverse bucket list, things I will never do the rest of my life.
I love
That
that.
includes Settlers of Catan. And I have to tell you, I was just watching a movie on Netflix the other day called No Hard Feelings. It's with Jennifer Lawrence. It's a kind of rom-com of a sort. And in it, she makes a kind of off-color joke about Settlers of Catan. And I thought she is so right. So anyway, that's how we made it. We got our shots, got our boosters, checked on our parents and grandparents. And it's hard to believe that it seems as if it was an era ago or an epoch ago, as
Weird.
opposed to, we're still in recovery mode.
Yeah, I think we're all in PTSD. Everything kind of I liken it to the whole Dolly melting clock thing. Everything just kind of melted and morphed into this weird uh spans of time. So it's very strange. Um, but I'm curious right now to know what you do, and I want to put you in front of a bunch of third graders. It's career day. One of the kids looks up and says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How would you answer that child?
I try to explain things in interesting, fun ways. I try to explain why your daddy or mommy has a job, why they might not be able to get a job, why they say it's more expensive to buy a house than it should be, or more expensive to buy a car, or concerned about gasoline prices. I want to help people understand why, for instance, President Biden is facing an uphill match to win re-election, to hold on to the White House, what it means when your parents say, wow, we save money and we're putting it in the stock market. Well, what's the stock market? Is that like a flea market? Is that on Sundays people are selling their leftovers, or fruits and vegetables are showing up in carts? So that's one part of what I do. I also write books. I've created a new way to teach arithmetic to children. If I'm talking to a third grader, I tell the third grader, I want you to ask your teacher about the math arrow, and ask your parents, and Google math arrow, or go to Amazon and look at the math arrow poster, because I think we might have a better way to show little kids, kids who are 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, how to do arithmetic. And wouldn't that be cool if we had a way to make numbers easier and mathematics less intimidating? And then I've got other activities. I'll tell the third grader, do you like music? Do you like stories and shows? Because I'm involved in a new musical called Glory Ride that was performed in London for 3 months over the spring and summer that we're going to bring to the States. So I do a whole lot of things,
Yeah.
and the most important of which is to be a husband and father.
So you've had I mean, you've been in the White House, you're a best-selling author, you've mentioned all of these other things. How did this happen? When you were in the 3rd grade, what was your dream? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, you know what? I was always interested uh, in performers, you know? So I was the kid who, with my parents, would be watching, I don't know, the Merv Griffin show or the Mike Douglas show on television. Or my father and my Aunt Kay would force us to watch the Lawrence Welk show on Sundays. And it was funny within my family. So my father liked it a lot. My Aunt Kay liked it a lot. My mom was indifferent. And my brother, sister, and I would always complain about it. And one by one, my father would throw us out of the living room for making fun of it. And then pretty soon it would be my dad sitting there by himself, well, with my Aunt Kay, and he'd say, all right, shucks, let's watch something else. Uh, you know,
That's
so
great.
uh, so uh, storytelling's always been something of interest to me. And I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out how to make complicated things captivating. When I taught economics at Harvard, and I'm sorry to be like name dropping a university I'm not quite pleased with at the moment, but
Yeah.
when I taught economics at Harvard, I had to teach various sophisticated ideas and the curve of the day in microeconomics or in macroeconomics, and this shifts this way, and the elasticity of this, and here's the coefficient. And I think most professors would just put it up on the chalkboard or the blackboard or the whiteboard, and spout out what's more or less in the textbooks. And I'd sit there beforehand and say, how am I going to make this stick? How can I explain these ideas in ways that will not just be relevant, but will be memorable, so that when a student takes the final exam or years later might actually remember what it means if the elasticity of demand is high or if it's low. So, that's kind of been a thread. When I worked in the White House, I advised the president on different policy matters, but I couldn't walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, you should do this because 5.74 or 3.4. No, who wants to hear that? Because he'd immediately say, well, first of all, what are you talking about? Secondly, Todd, even if I bought into your argument, how am I going to sell it to other people? How am I
Yeah.
going to go on TV and explain that to the American people? How am I going to explain it to voters? How am I going to persuade congressmen or senators to vote with me? You got to help me create some narrative so that we can get important stuff done. So I believe in narratives, not just for, willy-nilly fun and diversion, but actually in order to get important things done, you need to be able to explain them in ways that are compelling. And I've spent a good part of my career trying to do
So who's been a hero for you in your life?
that. That's a good question. There are people I admire or have admired. On the political front, Winston Churchill and Ronald Reagan. On the economics front, Milton Friedman and John Maynard Keynes, in fact, who are two divergent people who would have disagreed about everything. Um, Keynes was probably the most scintillating economist to have lived, and I, in my, if you will, broad interest, whether in theater or economics or finance and so on, Keynes was a bit like that. But Milton Friedman's ideas, I agree with more than I agree with Keynes. And Milton Friedman proved to be a very generous individual and scholar. I wrote my first book, which was called New Ideas from Dead Economists, when I was in graduate school. And that book has now been out for a long time in its fourth revised edition. It's in at least a dozen different languages and required reading in various places. But I was just a graduate student when I wrote it. I sent some sample chapters to the great Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize winning Nobel laureate, who had recently retired from the University of Chicago, was now at Stanford University. He didn't know me. And I wrote to him and said, I'm working on this book on the history of economic thought. Would you mind if I sent you a couple chapters to look? I never imagined he would reply, and he did. And he didn't just reply, he had detailed comments. And not only did he have detailed comments, I sent him a chapter about an eminent Victorian economist named Alfred Marshall. And Friedman, in great modesty, said, I have my ideas about Marshall, but I'm going to introduce you to Ronald Coase, who knows more than I do. Who was Ronald Coase? He was yet another Nobel Prize winning economist. So here I was, a mere graduate student, and two Nobel laureates in economics were tutoring me on my book. So for that alone, even if I didn't agree with Milton Friedman and many of his ideas, I admire him for that. And then, in my life, in my youth, I had certain famous individuals I never met that I considered leaders in a sense. And this might seem bizarre, but it reflects my interest in different sorts of spheres. So Captain Kirk, William Shatner,
Yeah,
I considered him to be a leader of mine.
yeah,
Uh, and it's a very complex character, but just about everyone knows Captain Kirk, and the battle within his own mind, within his own soul, between human emotions and the logic and the duty, was taught me how difficult it is to make decisions. Now, of course,
yeah,
it was entirely fictitious, but Captain Kirk. I grew up on the East Coast. Tom Seaver, the
yeah,
great number 41 pitcher for the New York Mets. I considered a leader because every fourth day Tom Seaver went out and pitched. The New York Mets in that era had virtually no hitting. They didn't have any home run hitter. They had a couple guys who every night, Don Clendenin, maybe he'd hit 19 or 21 or 20 home runs, but he was certainly not an all-star home. And so Tom Seaver had to get up there on that mound and do it himself. And at
yeah,
the end, and he pitched the entire 9 innings, and he'd walk off the mound, and his calves and knees would be covered in dirt because of his pitching style and the ferocity and the determination that he brought. And then, being a sports fan at that time, Muhammad Ali was a hero of mine. Although I'll tell you, I did get to meet Ali
yeah,
late in his career when he had been the beginning of his affliction with Parkinson's. I met him at a restaurant. We had a nice conversation. He, as he did with other people, he made fun of me, and then he actually took out a pen and paper and did a doodle for me, a drawing. And that was magical. And yet, over the years, I've kind of reassessed my view of Ali and his rivalry with Joe Frazier. And Joe Frazier was the more workmanlike guy. He didn't have the gift of gab. He wasn't stunningly handsome the way Ali was. And Ali was rather vicious in making fun of Joe Frazier. So over the years, I can't say I've soured on Ali, but I think I've got a more adult view of him
yeah.
than I did when I saw him as one of my heroes as a kid.
Yeah. So, we all have jobs, we all have people we love running into, and you've had the fortunate experience of being in the most hallowed place in this country in the White House. Who was somebody that you would run into there that you just love to talk to, was always excited to run into?
That's a great question. That's a great question. You know, when I served in the White House, and this was under the first President Bush, not long after taking office, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
Yeah.
And so the whole tenor of the White House changed. The security guards, their jaws were tightened. The Secret Service, I should say, the Secret Service, their jaws were tightened. They were much more careful about access and when you entered the West Wing and when not. I had conversations with Colin Powell before and after the war. And Colin Powell was enormously entertaining character. I mean, speaking of musical theater, he knew the lyrics to Oklahoma and other great musicals. He grew up in New York, and he grew up in a very cosmopolitan environment. And so, you know, the breadth of his knowledge was vast. Uh, and then when you spoke with him during the war, or tried to, because obviously he was quite busy and not able to engage in chit chat. It was a different general. You know, it was a different because it was wartime. And I would walk home from the White House or into the parking lot, and the last light I would see in the White House in the West Wing was Brent Scowcroft's office. Brent Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, was the president's national security advisor. And so, you know, we had all our troops on the line ready to liberate Kuwait. And there, the last light that would burn would be Brent Scowcroft, and often Colin Powell would be in there as well. So it was a time of great anguish, you know,
Yeah.
for the world.
Yeah.
And one does not know how those sorts of things work out. In fact, if you go back in history, go back those 30 years or so, you'll see that there were many prognosticators on CNN or elsewhere who said that we would lose 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 American lives in trying to liberate Kuwait. It's easy once the Iraqis fled, and it was an obvious route led by General Scowcroft and Colin Powell. It was easy then to say, oh, well, it wasn't so difficult to do. But if you listen to most of the commentators at that time, there was tremendous risk, tremendous risk.
Yeah. So in this very long career that you've had, full of so many
Wait, I'm
moments.
not that old. Hold on,
No, no,
Joe.
no. It's not about age, it's about experience.
Oh,
So
all
in
right.
in this very esteemed walk you've been on, what is it that gets you up every day? What is the motivator? What gets you out of bed? What gets you to be who you are?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, I have more or less been working for myself almost my entire career, with the exception I've had I guess three bosses in my life. One of them was the president of the United States, and George Bush only served for the first George Bush only served 4 years. Then my mentor in finance was one of the great hedge fund developers, Julian Robertson of the Tiger Fund. So I worked for Julian for a while. And then, you know, actually, I have to say, when I was in high school and college, I worked in the cafeteria. I worked as a landscaper. So I had some bosses then too. But the fact is, when you're working for yourself, I think you do wake up in the morning and say, well, nobody else is going to send me a paycheck today. You know, nobody else is going to make sure I get a raise. You have to do it yourself. I had the opportunity a year or so ago. I was invited by a big tech company to give a speech in Los Angeles. Also on the program was Jay Leno. And Jay and I spoke backstage before I went on, and then he followed me. And that says something. And what does that say? Here's Jay Leno, who obviously had made a fortune as hosting the Tonight Show and other comedy television endeavors. He showed up early. I mean, why was it that I got to speak with him in the green room? Because he was there.
Yeah.
Why was it that I got to? Because he actually was there long in advance of his walking on stage. Now, most people at that level, or even several tiers below, would show up at the last minute,
Yeah.
you know, and put on the microphone and waltz out and do their old jokes. But Jay Leno, he still has that blue collar mentality, if you will. He drove his own. He didn't get picked up by a limousine. He drove his own red pickup truck to LA Live. He showed up early. He hit his mark. He did his act, and it's because he remembers when he was a struggling comic and he wasn't sure he was going to get on at the comedy club. You know, they were going to try to get on seven comedians and maybe eight, and he was number eight, and he'd wait there and wait there night after night, hoping he'd finally get on. So I think there is, those folks who have the nerve or foolishness to work for themselves. There's a kind of clear built-in motivation that if you don't do it, nobody else will.
Yeah. So let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into the 20-year-old version of yourself, and you can give that young version of you a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained up to this point in your life. What advice would you dispense on that young version of you?
Um, I think I would be more systematic, more thoughtful about staying in touch with people I met along the way. Because you're right, I've been very lucky. I've met lots of famous people. I once felt like I held Henry Kissinger hostage. I was working for Firing Line, the television show that was hosted by William F. Buckley. And Henry Kissinger was going to be the guest, and he was in the green room, and they were doing his makeup, and so he was wearing the smock, and the makeup artist was working on him. And I started peppering him with questions about nuclear weapons, and the guy couldn't get away because he couldn't get out of the chair with half made up, one eyebrow done and one not. So who you meet in life is most of what life is. And I do think that it would be better if I had stayed in touch with more people along the way. Now, luckily, with social media, with Facebook, I now find myself having lunch or dinner with high school friends, with elementary school friends, with professional friends. But there was, a 30-year gap where none of that happened. And
Yeah.
I wish I'd been the sort of person who'd been more thoughtful about sending notes to people and dropping by and so on. So that's advice I would have given. I mean, other advice I wouldn't have taken as a 20-year-old.
Right.
You
That's
um,
it.
Time goes by very fast, but it doesn't feel that way when you're 20.
Yeah.
It does. I was watching a play at the Kennedy Center in DC with my wife when we were in our 20s and living in Washington, DC. I don't remember what the play was, but there was call it a 60, 65-year-old female character who was doing a little monologue on stage. And she said something, and the audience laughed. And my wife and I in our 20s, we chuckled, but we didn't really think it was that funny. And we certainly didn't think it was profound. But here's what I'll never forget it. Here's what the woman said. She said, as you get older, time goes by faster and faster. She said, by the time you hit 50, every 15 minutes, it's lunch. And when I was in my 20s, I mean, that made no sense to me.
Yeah. Right.
Now, every 15 minutes, Joe, it's lunch.
Uh-huh. That's right. That's totally right. So aside from your family, professionally speaking, what are you the proudest of? Of everything that you've done and accomplished, what are you the proudest of?
Um, I would say two things. So when I was a graduate student and I wrote that book on the history of economic thought called New Ideas from Dead Economists, um, I didn't think it would go anywhere. I mean, it came out, it got very good reviews, including the Wall Street Journal, but it certainly wasn't a bestseller. And I remember going to bookstores back in the days when you had what was pre-border, there were Walden bookstore, B
Mhm.
Dalton, every shopping mall had a couple small bookstores,
Yeah.
and wonder why is it that John Grisham gets all this space and they've only got one of mine. And I would take my book and put it in front of John Grisham's book in the front window. I'm sure I've cost him millions of dollars in sales.
Yeah.
So I thought the book would come and go. And if you asked me about the book in the first year or two, I would and said, "Oh, Todd, I loved your book." I would have said, "Oh, shucks, yeah, thanks, but it's nothing." Now the book's been out for literally decades, and as I said, it's in its fourth revised edition. I did the audio version of it recently for Amazon and Penguin Random House. And now I actually have economists of repute come up to me at conferences and say, I decided to study economics because I read New Ideas from Dead Economists when
Oh,
I was a freshman in college. And and to hear that from people who are now full professors, at Ivy League universities, my first thought is, I'm not that old, am I? Good thing I wrote it when I was a kid. Um, and my second thought is, I guess it was pretty good after all.
yeah,
Um, the other thing I'm proud of, and this has not have been nearly as widespread in its success. I mentioned this math arrow.
mhm,
Um, I have developed a new way to teach arithmetic to children. And my partners and I started a small software company. We've got iPad apps called Kyle Counts. And I'm not, Joe, telling you this as an advertisement. I mean, we basically give these things away, and there are posters on Amazon of the math arrow. And I go to schools and I try to persuade teachers and parents, here's a new way, especially if your kids have trouble developing number sense.
yeah.
And many students do. They're math phobic, or their parents feel that they should be farther along. And so I'm very proud that I've kind of rewritten a new way to do a number line and teach arithmetic to children. Again, I'm not proud that it has commercial success because it's a struggle to get new ideas into a classroom. But I think long after I'm gone, I suspect some will say, hey, I was able to figure out numbers because there's this thing called the math arrow. And if they say, and I have no idea where it came from, that's fine with me.
Right,
It's not, it doesn't have my name on it. It
right.
is what it is. And I just want parents and students to have an easier time when they're trying to learn arithmetic.
So, Todd, everyone out there has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, colleagues, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Well, these are very introspective questions, Joe.
This is the therapy part.
This is the therapy part. Yeah, this is the therapy part. Look, you know, I- I'm a guy who sees complex things in the world, but somehow I'm driven to explain them and understand them, but also try to find the humor in them. And I get that from my mother and my mother's side of the family. My mom, who is, very lively these days, just has a fabulous sense of humor. And I've tried to bring that to speeches I give. I mean, I go all around the world, and whether I'm in uh, the Mexican Stock Exchange or speaking in Dubai, um, I try to bring humor and wit to the issue because God knows there's tragedy and sorrow in human life. And Henry David Thoreau said most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Well, I don't like to be quiet. I don't like to be desperate. So I'm a guy who tries to make things interesting and tries to make things fun and tries not to just accept the conventional wisdom, but turn things around and look at it from another way. By the way, I'm no good at a Rubik's Cube. I have no interest in figuring out how to do a Rubik's Cube. If you give me a Rubik's Cube, I'm sure I'm below the 50th percentile of anybody else, anyone who's picked up a Rubik's Cube. But I try to look at other things going on out the window and
Yeah.
figure out how do I make sense of it. And that's who I am. I try to make sense of things and I try to add some fun to it, some zest.
And you've definitely done that. Thank you so much, Todd, for taking some time out today. And before we get out of the door, where's the best place for people to go to get all things related to your world?
Well, they can go to the website econtodd.com. That's econtodd.com. Or they can go to toddbuchholz.com or on X, formerly Twitter, uh,
Yeah.
at Econ Todd. So So there you go. And then look for our new musical, Glory Ride. Go to gloryridemusical.com. Gloryridemusical.com. It's one of the most fabulous stories in the history of the Second World War brought to life.
Yes, sir. Todd, this has been an honor. Thank you, sir, for your time, your candor, and opening up. I really appreciate it, man.
My pleasure, Joe. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.